Thank you very much for joining us tonight and for having this interview and the opportunity to speak with you about climate and energy policy. I think very much is going on in the United States and also in Europe. And yeah, I think it will be a very interesting interview. I may briefly introduce Ingo. He's sitting next to me. He's from the local media. Maybe can say just a few words.
Newspaper journalist.
Okay, nice to meet you, and thank you for the invite.
Yeah, and we want to publish the interview in a newspaper a few weeks, months later.
Oh, okay. All right. I could send you a text of my remarks if that will help.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay.
Fine.
Fine. Okay, then yeah, we just go through the questions, and maybe I'll start with the first one. You describe climate change as a wicked problem. Could you explain a bit why you choose this characterization and what consequences this should have for climate policy?
Well, the UN has framed climate change as a tame and simple problem with an obvious solution that's demanded by the science, which is eliminate fossil fuels. This oversimplification of both the problem and solution has led to deep polarization and policies and commitments that don't seem effective or politically feasible. Climate change is better characterized as a wicked problem with great complexity and uncertainties and a clash of different societal values. As a wicked problem, we need to acknowledge the futility of attempting to control the climate through emissions reductions. We can't control the climate any more than we could control the epidemic, which is another wicked problem. Instead, we should work to better understand climate processes, manage the impacts of climate and extreme weather, and sensibly try to minimize our adverse impacts on the environment.
In your publications, you talk about a manufactured consensus strategy of the UN in relation to the climate change. What exactly do you mean by this, and how do you think this approach influences the scientific debate and political decision-making?
There's an important difference between a scientific consensus and a consensus of scientists. For example, no one questions the fact that the Earth orbits the sun. We don't use the word consensus for well-established scientific facts or theories. On other topics that are poorly understood, scientific uncertainty and disagreement is a driving force for scientific progress. But when a poorly understood scientific topic is politically relevant, such as climate change, there's political pressure on scientists to establish a consensus. In effect, the UN has adopted a speaking consensus to power approach. This approach sees uncertainty and dissent as problematic and attempts to mediate this into a consensus to support their politically preferred outcome. Which scientists are included in producing the manufactured consensus makes a big difference in the outcome. Scientists like me with an opposing perspective aren't included in this process, and they're marginalized as deniers or anti-science. A manufactured consensus hampers scientific progress because of the questions that don't get asked and the investigations that aren't undertaken. The manufactured consensus on the complex problem of climate change has led to restricting the policy solution space and the mistaken idea that the climate can be controlled.
Thank you. Was there a particular event in your career when you decided to have a more critical position towards the climate policy? I mean, I know from your CV, from your scientific career that until 2010 or so, you were a convinced climate scientist.
Yeah, well,
to be more skeptical in this.
Well, I was concerned about the way uncertainty was being handled and the politicization of the whole issue, but I generally went along with the consensus. But, the real change point came in 2009 with the ClimateGate emails, which to me revealed a lot of unprofessional and unethical behavior and really showed me that there was a lot of coercion involved, intellectual coercion involved in developing this consensus. So that led me to really dig more deeply and not to take the word of what the IPCC was producing.
Thank you. Yeah, according to your publication, it is difficult to clearly attribute extreme weather conditions, weather events to man-made climate change. How do you see that public perception and communication of these connections, and what could be improved here?
Well, the main rationale for attributing each extreme weather event to fossil-fueled warming is to scare people and build political will for net zero objectives. Let's face it, the slow creep of global warming and sea level rise doesn't seem very alarming to the public. But blaming every extreme weather event on fossil-fueled warming is very effective in amping up the alarm. What could be improved here is to stop blaming every extreme weather event on climate change. Apart from being scientifically unjustified, this practice of extreme weather attribution detracts from dealing with the real causes of our vulnerabilities, such as poor land use policy, inadequate infrastructure, and poor governance.
Right, thank you. There was, yeah, maybe this was for you?
It was this.
We had already this one.
Okay, then working on.
Yeah.
Do you see a danger in the speed of climate change, the human-made climate change, when we burn the coal and oil in about 200 years, compared to a natural climate change who lasts for thousands of years? Is there a danger in the speed, so that animals and plants cannot adopt on a rapidly changing environment?
Okay, well, it's just not changing all that rapidly. I mean, over the past 100 years or so, we've seen an increase in 1.2 degrees centigrade. Okay, and during this period, the global population has increased substantially. Global poverty has been reduced substantially. Agricultural productivity has increased substantially. So we've done pretty well, for the first 1.2 degrees centigrade of warming. And so they're projecting another 1.2 degrees centigrade of warming under the medium emissions scenario by the end of the 21st century. So there's no particular reason to think that this is going to be any worse in terms of being able to adapt than the first 1.2 degrees centigrade of warming. It's the extreme emissions scenario, which was predicting 4 to 5 degrees centigrade of warming. Well, that extreme emission scenario is off the table. The UN climate negotiators have abandoned the extreme emission scenario since 2021, and they're working off of the medium emission scenario. So yes, I agree that if it was 5 degrees centigrade of warming, this would be very difficult to adapt to that over, 2 centuries of time, but that's not what people are projecting anymore.
Right, thank you. Guess we come to this question later a bit more in detail. Next questions are a bit about criticism and current climate policies. You sharply criticize the urgency and goals of the net zero policy, especially the rapid shift away from fossil fuels. What risks do you see in this approach, particularly in terms of energy and food security?
Well, if human-caused climate change was not an issue, over the course of the 21st century, I would still expect to see a natural transition away from burning fossil fuels and towards more abundant and secure sources of energy that are cheap and clean. The biggest problem with the net zero policy is the prescribed urgency. which then prefers wind and solar power since they can be implemented quickly. This misguided framework for the transition is increasing energy costs and reducing reliability, with associated damage to industry and the economy. And all of this is occurring against a background of rapidly growing demand for energy and for materials such as steel, cement, and fertilizer. This growing demand for energy is driven not only by developing countries, but also by artificial intelligence and other technological advances. Net zero goals will almost certainly not be met, since they aim beyond the scope of what's doable and politically feasible.
You mentioned that the focus on emission-related targets often neglects other ecological problems such as land use or biodiversity loss. What could a more balanced climate policy look like that take these aspects more into account?
Well, with the emphasis on climate change and emissions reductions, we've lost sight of traditional environmental goals, such as preventing air and water pollution, species protection, and preserving natural spaces. Wind and solar power have a huge land footprint, which is even larger if you include the requisite transmission lines. In the 1970s, Greenpeace got its start with the Save the Whales campaign. Now, with wind turbines off the US Atlantic coast, Greenpeace is silent about dead whales washing up on the shore. Personally, I think their traditional environmental concerns are more important than CO2 emissions. Misguided alarmism about the impacts of CO2 emissions has unfortunately led to this neglect of traditional environmental concerns.
Yeah, and on the other hand, with the promotion of renewable energies, we have also associated other problems. Renewable energies will require 60 times more lithium by 2040, for example, and where fossil fuel sources remain cheap but emission intensive. If we reduce it to this sentence, how should a rational policy balance these raw material and cost factors? And can the environmental costs of mining lithium and rare earths, for example, be seriously quantified?
Not just the materials requirement, it's also about the life cycle environmental impacts, including waste. As an example, wind turbines have a lifespan of about 15 years. These wind turbines are not recyclable, and there are already big wind turbine graveyards in Texas. Let's face it, there's no energy source that doesn't have an environmental impact of some sort. A holistic evaluation is needed of all relevant factors associated with a power system: life cycle costs, resource and land use requirements, and life cycle environmental impacts, including waste and CO2 emissions. It's not just about the CO2 emissions, clearly. Balancing all these factors involves value judgments, which are not easily quantified and may vary regionally, but it still needs to be done.
Additional question, do you see somewhere on the world this holistic approach you're just promoting? We consider all the factors and impacts of different sources.
Individual utility companies, I've seen them try to do this for their own utility, but on a national level or certainly on an international level, not at all, because the CO2 emissions has such primacy. It's like nothing else matters, but it does.
Certainly, yeah. Yeah, going to the Paris Climate Agreement, considering the withdrawal recently of the United States from the Paris Climate Agreement, where America has 30% of the global CO2 emissions and China about 33% and India 7%, where the latter ones are classified as developing countries and are exempted from strict emission targets and continuing to build coal-fired power plants. Do you think the Paris Climate Agreement has failed? Should it be, can it be reformed? And if so, how?
Well, after spending $9 trillion, the Paris Agreement has managed to reduce the percentage of power from global fossil fuel use only slightly, and it still exceeds 80%. The main accomplishments of the Paris Agreement have been a substantial slowdown of the Sustainable Development Goals in Africa and near destruction of the industrial base of several European countries. The Paris Agreement and net zero policies have clearly failed. Apart from the political and economic issues, we simply don't know how to achieve net zero on a time scale of several decades. The urgency of the net zero deadlines were motivated by a long-standing desire to eliminate fossil fuels, which was then supported by highly unrealistic extreme emission scenarios and inadequate climate models, along with a manufactured consensus of activist scientists. With the US and Argentina withdrawing from the Paris Agreement, I see more of a nationalistic and transactional approach to dealing with energy policy and environmental concerns, which I think will be better for everyone in the long run. For example, China is probably more motivated by bad air quality than by CO2 emissions in its energy policy. Let's work with that and stop pretending that the globalist approach of the Paris Agreement is workable or beneficial.
Yeah, that's just we have this question later, and this is more a bottom-up approach, what you are proposing, not so much regulating from the top, but more yeah, have a bottom-up approach for solving these problems. But we discussed that maybe later on again.
Hey, yep.
Okay. So do you think global CO2 emissions pricing is sensible and feasible?
Well, economists argue that CO2 emissions pricing would work to efficiently reduce emissions by making polluters pay. However, carbon taxes and emissions trading schemes haven't worked very well to date. A fully global system would face many political and economic barriers. People don't want to pay more for their energy. In the US, there's great angst when gasoline prices increase even slightly. Beyond minor efforts to reduce energy use and increase efficiency, consumers have limited choices for reducing their energy consumption, and the choices can be very expensive. So the end result of emissions pricing doesn't necessarily reduce CO2 emissions very much. And further, if CO2 emissions turn out to be not particularly dangerous, then pricing of CO2 emissions will distort economic decisions in non-productive ways.
Just one additional question. I mean, many activists, especially here in Germany, combine their critics on or combine their critics with the critics on capitalism. So many people here in activists in Germany say we need another economic system. And capitalism is
it's part of the globalist agenda to declare global warming and public health as global issues that nations are not capable of dealing with, and we need to abandon capitalism and even democracy, to achieve this. I mean, this is a big power grab by the globalists, and it's very bad news for human well-being and for national sovereignty. I'm very concerned about this.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at Fridays for the Future, for example, here in Germany, they strictly combine this. They're not only for reducing CO2, but the agenda behind that is to abolish the way of living we are having in the Western world.
I think America is similar.
Well, America is pushing back. The EU seems a lot more supportive of this than the US. The US is really pushing back, particularly under President Trump.
Pushing back in a way, in which way?
Against the globalist agenda.
Okay. Yeah. Indeed. And will he be successful, by the way?
I'm sorry?
Will he be successful, Donald Trump? Will he be successful?
He's already chalked up a few successes, and it's less than 2 months. We'll see how this plays out, but it's pretty seismic over here in terms of what's going on. I think a lot of it to me, is in the right direction. There's a few things that he wants to do that seem puzzling, but, we'll just have to see how it plays out. The bureaucracy is really entrenched, and there's so much that's entrenched in the US, and he's trying to, take a machete to it. So I don't know. Have to see how it plays out, but there's already been some successes.
Yeah, yeah. We have seen recent polls yesterday that the Democrats are fallen to 20-something% from the voters. So
I know the mainstream
you have seen that
media.
probably as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's a general sense that, at least 25% of the government is a waste, and that the government is too intrusive in our lives. So there's that general underlying sentiment in the US that, I said, well, we're just going to let Trump see what he can do about it. So he has a surprising amount of support for this in the population.
Yeah, interesting. Okay.
Well. You criticize hasty decarbonization. What political measures do you propose to promote a balanced energy transition that takes equal account of the economy, social stability, and the environment?
With regards to the environment, there are 5 main issues: pollution of air, water, and soil, land use footprint, resource use, ecosystem impacts, and CO2 emissions. Personally, I would rank them in that order, with CO2 at the bottom, but that's partly a value judgment. In my book, Climate Uncertainty and Risk, I argued that in evaluating different sources of electric power, a holistic evaluation is needed of all relevant factors, including both economic and environmental. Life cycle costs of power production, transmission, and the required infrastructure, land use requirements, costs of unreliability of electric power, and life cycle environmental impacts, including waste and CO2 emissions. Too often, only the costs of power production and CO2 emissions are considered. And it's not easy to do this, make this kind of assessment, and there's no one-size-fits-all solution here. Different regions with different natural resources, economies, and ecosystems will weight these factors differently.
What do you think about the new dual fluid reactors of nuclear power? Have you heard about this?
What did I hear about?
Dual fluid reactors. This is a new type of nuclear plant.
Dual what? I'm not understanding.
Dual fluid.
Oh, dual fluid. Oh, yeah. I mean, but there's lots of exciting technologies in nuclear. I mean, this is very exciting. And I'm looking forward to implementation of the new nuclear power plants. In the US, the regulatory hurdles against nuclear power are just crazy. So I think in the US, they're trying to break down these requirements so we can get nuclear power plants installed up and running in 4 years with some of these new technologies. Hopefully that's going to work. That would be the answer to a lot of problems.
Yeah, indeed. Yeah, just coming back to the question, having more a bottom-up approach, as we said, with Argentina and US, you have a more national energy policy rather than a global implementation of policies. So you're proposing this decision-making under deep uncertainty as an alternative to the traditional break then act strategy. Could you give a concrete example of how this strategy could be applied in climate policy?
Okay, decision-making under deep uncertainty inverts the predict then act approach to decision-making. Rather than agreeing on assumptions or predictions through a politically manufactured consensus, decision-making under uncertainty is an agree-upon decision approach. The agree-upon decision approach bypasses provocative debates over whose unknowable facts or predictions are most accurate. This only leads to stalemates, not solution finding. By contrast, the decision-making under deep uncertainty approach supports development of policies that perform satisfactorily over a wide variety of possible outcomes and can be adapted over time to unforeseen future conditions. This approach has been applied to many adaptation This approach has been applied to many adaptation projects, including sea level rise defenses, among others. The approach can also be applied to mitigation of emissions. For example, there's broad agreement on the need for more research and technological development in the production and transmission of electric power. Everyone can agree on that, whether or not they're alarmed about fossil-fueled warming.
In your publications, you emphasize the importance of robust decision-making and no-regret strategies. In this sense, what measures would you suggest as particularly useful for countries with different economic conditions?
Robust decision-making includes no-regret strategies, reversible and flexible decisions, safety margin decisions, and decisions with reduced time horizons. The basic principles of robust decision-making are broadly applicable to the entire range of climate-related decision-making. In robust decision-making for wicked problems, we need to acknowledge that control is limited, the future is unknown, and it's difficult to determine whether or not the impact of a policy will be positive. It's sort of a learning.
The decision making, I mean, what kind of framework would you need? Do you think the market economy is fully sufficient for this kind of decision making, or do you need some sort of framework?
Well, again, if you're doing a bottom-up approach, and these are relatively small, locally based decisions, I think this provides an opportunity for communities, states, individual countries to explore the options that will best secure their own well-being. So once you take the coercion out of it, you know, from the top-down mandate, and you're working more from a bottom-up perspective, I don't know that the regulations are needed so much.
Okay. Right. You argue that adaptation often brings more local and regional benefits than global emission reductions. Which adaptation strategies do you consider to be particularly effective, and how could these be implemented in developing countries?
Well, let's assume that climate model projections for the 21st century under the medium emission scenario correct, and that we somehow manage to achieve net zero by 2050. Under those conditions, we would expect, say, another 1.2 degrees centigrade warming by 2100. So by the end of the 21st century, we would barely notice any change to our climate or extreme weather against the background of natural weather and climate variability. So this is a low bar for adaptation strategies to have a greater benefit than emissions reduction. One of the biggest adaptation needs, especially for developing countries, but for all countries, is management of water resources to avoid flooding and to provide reserves during drought. Much of the agriculture in developing countries is rain-fed. Irrigation and precision agriculture, enabled by better weather predictions, have been shown to make a substantial difference for development and food security. And we realize the benefits now, not potentially, 50 or 100 years in the future.
Yeah, I could have a more pragmatic approach to the energy transition that does not rely on an immediate shift away from fossil fuels. What role should fossil fuels play in the coming decades, and how could a sustainable energy transition be shaped?
A primary strategy for reaching net zero has been to kneecap the fossil fuel companies through regulations and pricing. However, the International Energy Agency has stated that clean energy investment and demand reductions will drive the energy transition, not a premature removal of fossil fuel resources. Forced reductions in the supply of fossil fuels cause adverse and counterproductive effects. In spite of these sensible recommendations by the International Energy Agency, some European countries continue to proceed by kneecapping the fossil fuel companies and even nuclear power plants without viable replacements. This is not only causing problems for electric power systems, but also for agriculture, steel, and cement production. Clean energy supply needs to precede fossil fuels phase out, not the other way around. In this way, we safeguard energy security and minimize energy market volatility in stranded assets. So I'm not proposing anything radical here, mainly highlighting what the International Energy Agency has recommended.
Do you see a danger that the Trump administration, with the agreed drill, baby, drill, destroy any pragmatic and reasonable climate policy? Are they too radical in their change back, pushback?
Okay, what Trump is looking to do, primarily he needs more energy. He wants a huge amount of energy to bring back, steel manufacturing and a lot of manufacturing in the country, and also to support artificial intelligence and a lot of advances. So they're looking to hugely produce more energy. And they're very serious about nuclear power. They see that Trump hates wind power. He's not talking about coal anymore, but Trump's energy czar, Doug Burgum, has mentioned we may be reopening coal power plants in the near term until we can bring nuclear power plants online. So I don't think he's looking to just double down on fossil fuels or dirty energy. I mean, the issue is more energy, and let's make it cost effective, reliable, and clean as we can make it.
Do you think this is realistic?
The issue is on what time scale. Okay. Sure, everybody's going to be producing more power. Yeah, so we'll see. I mean, the big issue is whether they can untangle the regulatory environment in the US so it doesn't take 12 years to build a nuclear power plant. To get all the approvals and all the this, that, and the other. It's just crazy. They really tie 1.5 arms, behind your back in terms of if you're trying to build a nuclear power plant. So if he can breach that barrier, I would say, yep, he'll be successful. So, I mean, now they're very serious about AI in the US and not letting China win in the AI race. And China's investing very heavily. And it's, robotics and all of these new technologies have tremendous potential upside, but it's going to require a lot of power. And the US is trying to get ready for all that.
That's interesting, yeah. But by the way, isn't it in contradiction to what is Elon Musk proposing with his companies? I mean, Musk is proposing clean energy, and now he's advisor to a government which promotes right the opposite.
Okay, well, okay, this is
conflict?
interesting. Okay, Musk is big on solar power. Okay, so he's very big on solar power. Trump really doesn't see solar power as the answer, but he doesn't have any big objections to it. Trump really doesn't like wind farms. That's what Trump doesn't like. They're just a complete blight on the landscape, killing whales, killing birds. I mean, he really doesn't like wind power. But the interesting thing is that the electric vehicle Tesla, which used to be the darling of the environmental left in the US, is now being boycotted by the same people. In fact, one Democratic senator who owned a Tesla say, I can't bear to drive a Tesla because I detest Elon Musk. And he went out and bought this big gas guzzler pickup truck. And so now all the, what I would say, the right-wing people are buying Teslas. So that's been, it's just rather crazy. I mean, that It just reminds us that all of this is all about politics. It's not about fundamental convictions about environmental things.
Right. Yeah, that brings us to the next question. You probably know Michael Mann. He's one of your favorite colleagues, I would say. And International Voice as him, Michael Mann, born of a petrostate, United States. We discussed that before. Do you share this assessment, or do you see short and long-term economic benefits in Trump's administration and in Trump's energy policy? Sorry.
I'm glad you asked this question. I pay absolutely no attention to anything Michael Mann says for reasons that we don't need to go into here. A petrostate is a country with a resource-based economy that heavily relies on the export of petroleum. By contrast, the US economy is driven by manufacturing, technology, and financial systems. Yes, the US has petroleum resources, albeit dwindling ones, but the main concern of the US is to provide abundant, reliable, secure, and inexpensive energy to support its complex economy, whatever the source of the energy. So the US is most definitely not a petrostate. Not only is Michael Mann factually incorrect in his statement, but his statement attempts to smear the US, particularly the Trump administration, by equating the US morally with petrostates such as Iran and Libya. This is typical behavior from Michael Mann, which is why I pay no attention to him. Regarding the Trump administration, I see both long-term and short-term benefits to his energy policy. He recognizes the need for a huge amount of additional electric power in the near term to support manufacturing, AI, and other high-tech developments. In the short term, the US may even recommission some coal plants that have been shut down. In the intermediate term, they're seeking to remove the regulatory and technological barriers so that nuclear power plants can be built in 4 years, not 10 years or more. By focusing on energy abundance and innovation, I suspect that in the long term, the US will inadvertently transition to carbon-free energy more rapidly than Europe, with its emphasis on wind and solar, and that the US will be more successful in advancing its prosperity by taking this approach.
Right. You mentioned that wind and solar energy alone are not enough to secure the energy supply. What other technologies, we were discussing nuclear plants or approaches to a fluid reactor, for example, do you see as promising for diversifying the energy supply and reducing emissions at the same time?
Well, natural gas has been shown to be a good bridge fuel, replacing coal and biomass burning. Like I said previously, nuclear power is a very good solution, and the Generation 4 nuclear power plants have some exciting advances. Advanced geothermal energy is another technology that shows promise. I also see some promising advances in solar power, and I think rooftop solar with battery backup can be a good solution for households. And I'm sure there'll be additional developments over the next 30 to 50 years. And there's also potential advances in energy transmission and storage.
You criticize the apocalyptic rhetoric in climate communication and its influence on public perception. In your opinion, how should communication about climate risk be shaped in order to promote a more realistic and less alarmistic perspective?
Well, the whole point of climate communication has been to scare people into supporting net zero policies and being willing to make the needed sacrifices. Towards these ends, climate communicators use propaganda techniques that exaggerate the risks and harm. For example, a key element to generating alarm is claiming that all weather disasters are caused by climate change, while ignoring natural climate variability, the historical data on extreme weather, plus failures in land use policy, emergency management, and governance that contributed to the disaster. The whole framing of the climate change problem and its solution by the UN is synergistic with alarmism, particularly the outrageous statements made by UN officials, including climate catastrophe, existential threat, code red, road to climate hell. The whole issue needs to be reframed in terms of challenges and opportunities, and not trying to scare people into supporting an unworkable policy proposal.
We talked about psychological factors that influence the perception of climate risks. How can decision makers and scientists use these factors to develop more effective strategies without stirring up fear?
In my opinion, the best way to communicate a risk is honestly and with full account for the uncertainties and what we don't know. We should also communicate the trade-offs of the various policy options and their unintended consequences. Long-term risks from human-caused climate change isn't an issue that most of the population should be concerned about. And it's certainly not something that we should be scaring school children over.
Thank you. Yeah, coming back to the social implications in your publications, you propose the idea of a human-centric approach as opposed to the climate is everything perspective. How could this approach be implemented politically and socially to promote both human well-being and environmental goals?
Well, the UN Sustainable Development Goals are human-centric, which include reducing poverty and hunger, increasing access to energy, and development of industry, innovation, and infrastructure. Net zero policies are adversely affecting the realization of the Sustainable Development Goals through tying international aid for development to CO2 mitigation efforts. A human-centric approach prioritizes the Sustainable Development Goals over net zero. It's easy to imagine a future in which the net zero goals haven't been reached, but that is overall better for human well-being and ecological health than a world in which net zero was achieved at great cost.
You mentioned that even if net zero targets are achieved by 2050, the impact on the climate and extreme weather events would hardly be noticeable by 2100. How do you see the long-term future of climate policy and what priorities should be set?
Even if net zero policies successfully eliminated emissions, and if we believe the climate models, then it's likely we wouldn't notice any change to the climate or extreme weather events by the end of the 21st century against the background of natural climate variability. My recommendation is that we should abandon the global top-down approach of the Paris Agreement in favor of a bottom-up approach. We should abandon emissions targets and deadlines in favor of providing abundant energy for human development and advancement, including the Sustainable Development Goals. We should conduct research and development towards deploying clean energy sources, such as advanced nuclear, and emphasize adaptation and increasing resilience to extreme weather events. We need to acknowledge that control is limited, the future is unknown, and it's difficult to determine whether the impact of our policies will be positive. We need to accept that climate change, whether human-caused or natural, will continue to disrupt natural systems and human well-being. By acknowledging that there's no road back, we can focus on the road ahead.
Thank you. Then finally, for the future prospects, what role science should play in the coming decades to better understand the complexity of climate change and enable informed decisions? And maybe an additional question, under the new Trump administration, I've seen on X that a lot of subsidies and funding is rejected from institutes in the US. And does this, in your opinion, hamper or delay research on climate issues? How would you see that?
Okay. Climate science has been hijacked by political activists and a mediocre cadre of scientists who focus on analyzing extreme outcomes from climate models to warn against adverse impacts. As a result, we've lost a generation of climate dynamicists who focus on trying to actually understand the complexities of the climate system. Climate scientists need to get back to the basics and do research in the hardcore atmospheric, oceanic, geologic, and solar sciences. The science policy interface has also been hijacked by political activists. Not only does this lead to poor policies, but it also interferes with the scientific process. At the science policy interface, I think the future lies in the so-called wicked science approaches. Wicked science is massively transdisciplinary, including natural sciences and engineering, along with social sciences and humanities. Wicked science uses approaches from complexity science and systems thinking, and includes the experiential and operational knowledge of a range of stakeholders and engineers. The wicked science approach acknowledges the complexity and uncertainties and the clashes in values, and it abandons the idea of control and moral and political coercion in favor of greater understanding and reducing vulnerability.
Do you see a chance under Trump that this will improve, that science will become more independent from interests? Is that a real chance under Trump?
Well, yeah, we need to, yeah, it sort of delineates two separate fields. One is the pure science of trying, climate dynamics, trying to understand the climate system. And the second is this wicked science, which interacts with the policy process and stakeholders, in their decision making. So, a single scientist could maybe participate in both, but right now we've just lost sight of the basic fundamental research, and we have a very naive approach to dealing with the science policy interface. So this is doing harm both to the policy process and the scientific process.
So that means you're optimistic that the political part of the science will be cut off under the new administration, and the pure science, as you just said, will remain. And is that what you're saying?
Okay, in terms of federal funding, I think, the basic research will still be funding. It's what I would call the impacts research, and the social justice. A huge amount of federal funding in the climate area goes to what I would call non-physical science research. It's related to social justice and impacts. I think a lot of that's going to be cut in the US. But wicked science, this doesn't need to be federally funded. It can be a process that, engages local governments, state governments, and companies, firms in the bottom-up approach to solving problems. So it doesn't necessarily, how to effectively do wicked science is something that maybe they should, explore in the universities. But the actual application to real world problems doesn't really need federal funding.
Excellent. Very well, yeah, thank you very much. Interesting perspectives. Do you have any recommendations for us here in Europe as a final question?
Oh my God. I don't know, is to restart your nuclear power plants. That's number one. Just get over your aversion to nuclear power. That's the most important thing. Solar power to me makes no sense in Northern Europe. You just don't have enough sun other than for a few months. So, just really get back to nuclear power. France has had the right idea all along on this. And to me, that's the single most useful thing that the European could do. The European seems very solid with the globalist approach. And they're also more risk adverse than in the US. The US sort of emphasizes innovation over precaution, whereas I think the Europeans err on the side of precaution to the extent of stifling innovation. So to me, the Europeans have to figure out how to really foster innovation and not being overly precautionary. That's what I see for Europe. Nuclear power and foster innovation.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Very interesting perspective on us here in Europe. Yeah, I think there will remain a lot of discussion in the next months and years about climate policy, about energy policy, and the approach to get a better future for all and a better perspective. Thank you very much at this today
Okay,
for the
thank
interview and
Enjoyed talking with you.
everything.
Yeah.